All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we're talking about Dean Pease saying he's only installed 60% of the offense. And I did a little bit of investigation to find out what the other 40% is. And it ties directly in to the Falcons offseason additions of Casey Hayward, Lorenzo Carter, and much more.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms: Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. And if you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, hit that bell, give us a like. You'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today's episode, we're talking all about Dean Pease and him saying that only 60% of his playbook was installed in 2021. And you guys know me, I'm a hater. I'm always Mr. Skepticism. I'm like, okay, sure, Dean, sure, coach, right? And I know fans eat that stuff up, right? Dean Pease, especially the Dean Pease is going to fix it crowd. I think fans love overrating scheme. And for those of you that don't understand my philosophy on talent versus scheme, when it comes to offense versus defense, I think offense is probably 50-50, arguably 60-40 in favor of scheme over talent, but defense is like 75-25 when it comes to talent versus scheme. And basically the reason I believe that is because essentially everybody's running the same type of coverages, everybody's has hybrid fronts. It's really not about the scheme that one team runs over the other. It's about, do you have the guys that can run, hit, tackle, cover, pressure, all these various things to execute that scheme. But after thinking about it a little bit longer and being like, okay, let's take what Dean Pease is saying at face value. I started thinking about something, I was reading about several months ago called Sims and Creepers. And it was a term that I had never really heard of up until I was reading Ted Nguyen of the Athletics article back in October that he wrote called Defining Simulated Pressures and Creepers, Schemes that Involve Rushing for Defenders with Deception. And I'll put a link to that in the description. And in that article, he was talking with Chris Vassar of the Make Defense Great Again podcast, who Dean Pease was a frequent guest on that podcast back during the 2020 season. So go check that out, as well as, of course, subscribe to The Athletic. And they were talking about Sims and Creepers. And, at that point in time, I had never heard those terms before, but I understood the concepts that they were referring to and learning the terms of what they were doing. And we'll use Ted's definition that he wrote in that article. Sims and Creepers are both four-man rushes that involve bringing one or two second or third level defenders while dropping one or two first level defenders. So an example would be blitzing an inside linebacker while dropping a defensive lineman. And he quoted Vassar in that article, who added, some people separate them as creepers or zones, and Sims are man. Creepers, we're not showing pressure. Sims, we are showing pressure. And so I'll use those same definitions as we continue today's conversation, and to add some further context in terms of how I view these things, to give you guys some examples to visualize sort of what we're talking about. Sort of a classic example of a sim is you'll see those linebackers, whether it's a 3-4 or 4-3, line up in the A gap. And then for those of you that need a reminder, the A gap is the gap between the center and the guard. And that will force offenses to have to adjust their protections because they can't let a free rusher come through the A gap unless your name is Mike Person and you're facing the 49ers in 2015 and that player is Navarro Bowman. I will never let it go. But, the A gap is basically the fastest route to the quarterback, right? And so you have to sort of adjust your protections inside out. And so when you bring those defenders up into that A gap, the offensive line, and you can sort of simulate them, and oftentimes those guys may not come, right? But these second level defenders, it could be a linebacker, it could be a defensive back, and you drop a guy and you wind up, sitting four. But with these sort of simulated pressures, you're often lining up 6 or 7 guys on the line of scrimmage, and that confuses offenses. And that's a very valuable thing, obviously, for defense. When we do talk about where scheme can influence things, that can be a way where scheme can sort of throw off offenses. Now, the classic example of a creeper that I think is easiest for Falcon fans to visualize is that sort of nickel cornerback blitz. And we saw this a bunch with Brian Poole back in the day. Go back to that Packers game in the NFC Championship game. Packers go empty. Brian Poole comes, unblocked on that nickel cornerback blitz. They drop a defender into that flat where they would, typically run their cover three. That would be the normal responsibility for that slot cornerback covering the flat. And of course, Brian Poole's wrecking Aaron Rodgers and whatever. So those are sort of the classic examples of what you can visualize for a sim and a creeper. And now that you sort of hopefully have a better understanding of what we're talking about when I throw these terms around for the remainder of today's episode, I wanted to investigate how DMPs use these two concepts in 2021. And I'll share my findings as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to let you know about the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows and 4 different personalities breaking down all of Atlanta sports as well as national sports. Of course, there's A to Z with Mark Zeno, there's Hitting Hard with John Chukri, and of course, ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on your preferred podcast platform. And if you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you will also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast breaking down every win, every loss for the Atlanta Braves this season. So go subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I'm investigating Dean Pease's defense, but if you're investigating ways to maybe potentially pop that question or find that special someone, that fine piece of jewelry, you should head on over to Blue Nile. They have these simple online tools that let you pick your size, your shape, clarity. If you're looking for that perfect one-of-a-kind engagement ring for that special someone, or if you're looking for something a little less permanent but still great for that person, you might have some trouble choosing whatever that thing is. And of course, Blue Nile has the jewelry experts on hand 24/7 via phone, via chat, to help you find a memorable gift that fits your budget. So make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On listeners get $50 off all purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Just use the promo code Locked On. That's code Locked On, LOCKEDON. And every order is also insured. It ships free. It arrives in a discreet package so that it won't give away what's inside. So shop stress free and find your forever piece by going to BlueNile.com today. So guys, initially when I was doing this investigation, my plan was, I'll just watch the last 5 or so games of 2021. I could probably wind up watching more of that, but ain't nobody got time for that. And I also watched the last 5 or so games from 2020 to sort of compare and contrast it, how Dean Pease was utilizing these sims and creepers versus how Raheem Morris was utilizing sims and creepers. Because of one of the things I recall, and we talked about this briefly on the podcast during the season, was that Raheem Morris tended to be a little bit more aggressive, dialing up blitzes. And sort of the conclusion I came to at the time was that was owed to the fact that Raheem Morris could be a little bit more aggressive because of, having a little bit more confidence that the offense would be able to put points on the board. So in the event that they screwed up or whatever the case may be, they could go back and get those points, while Dean Pease had to be a lot more conservative because the offense wasn't clicking at the highest level. And so any big play that they gave up last year, could be the difference between winning and losing. But what I did also do, in addition to looking at those last 5 games, I did wind up going back and looking at the first 4 games of the season back when Isaiah Oliver was healthy before he exited in that second quarter of the Washington game in week 4 with an ACL tear. But looking back at those final 5 games in both 2020 and 2021, when it came to the usage of Sims, again, just looking at four-man blitzes when the Falcons were in man coverage in 2020, they ran those on about 13.5% of their snaps. In 2021, it was a little lower at 10.6%. In 2020, they ran creepers, again, four-man blitzes out on their zone coverage on about 8.1% of plays. And in 2021, that was 13.2% of plays. So comparatively, Raheem Morris was a little bit fonder of Sims, while Dean Pease was much fonder of creepers. Now, generally, Raheem Morris was a lot more aggressive, as I said, blitzing, because he brought five or more defenders on those final five games in 2020 on about 27% of snaps, while Dean Pease only did that on about 13% of snaps. And this was a contributing factor if you go back to January and February, where we were talking about, the notion that Dean Pease wanted to become this man heavy scheme. And I was very skeptical of that back then. And it seems like, my opinion proved to be correct in the end, and the Falcons going more towards a zone heavy scheme. But part of the reason why I was skeptical of the Falcons moving towards that man heavy scheme was in large part due to the fact that it didn't seem like Dean Pease was as aggressive calling those blitzes as you typically find in teams that run a lot more man coverage. And so initially, after just watching or just looking at the numbers and the charting from the last five games in each of the last two seasons, I was just like, okay, maybe Dean Pease will run a few more creepers. But then I said, you know what? Let me go back and look at the first month of the season when Isaiah Oliver was healthy to see how Dean Pease presumably ran the scheme that he wanted to run, because we know how fond he was of Isaiah Oliver. And we know that once he got injured and the Falcons were forced to play some rookies like Avery Williams and Darren Hall and Richie Grant all in that nickel cornerback spot for the remainder of the season, he even said as much that he wasn't necessarily doing all the things that he wanted to do. He had to dial things back. And so looking at those first few games, I realized, looking at that he was a lot different than what he did in the final 5 weeks of the season, right? In the first two games alone, he called creepers on 33% of his own calls, and comparatively to the final five games when that was only 13%. Now that fell then to only 8% in the weeks 3 and week 4 games combined against the Giants and Redskins. I'm sorry, the Commanders. I don't know. What do I call them? Do I still refer to them as the football team because we played them last year, or do I call them the Commanders? I don't know, guys. You tell me. Let me know in the comments. But again, 8% is lower than the 13% he ran at the end of the season. But I think the reason behind that reduction that Dean Pease had, where he ran these creepers a whole lot in the first 2 weeks, was because it wasn't that effective in those games. And I remember Dean Pease talking about how he kind of threw too much on players' plate going into that week 1 game against Philadelphia, and he realized he kind of had to back off of that. And then another thing that stood out, because I remember talking about this back in September, was we were talking about then how much Stephen Means dropped into coverage in those first 2 games of the season. And that's a perfect indication of those creepers that we're talking about, where, again, Stephen Means being one of those first level defenders dropping into coverage, and one of those second level defenders, whether it's a cornerback or a linebacker, coming on the blitz. And in the first 2 games alone, Stephen Means dropped into coverage about 30 times, right? For the remainder of the season, he dropped into coverage just 60 times, or roughly, over the course of the 12 games that he played for the rest of the season, about 5 times per game. Then you look at Dean Pease's usage of Sims, right? In the first couple of games, again, it was basically the same as it was at the end of the season. About 10% of his man calls included Sims. So it's notable that seems to indicate that Dean Pease is not necessarily a big fan of the Sims, because nothing changed from the beginning of the year to the end of the season. But looking at the man coverage stuff and as well, I did notice that he was a lot more fond of bringing 5 or more rushers in those first few weeks of the season than he was at the end of the season, right? We noted that Raheem Morris dialed it up like 27, whatever it was, 26, 27% of the time. Dean Pease had a similar number in those first couple of games. In week 1 against the Eagles, he brought 5 or more on zone plays about 21% of the time. That then dropped to 7% in week 2 against the Bucks, but then rebounded to 25% in weeks 3 and weeks 4. And I think the reason why he dialed it back in week 2, because of course they were facing the Bucks and Tom Brady. And of course, the 2 times that they did run it in that game, they got burned by Chris Godwin for gains of 16 and 26 yards. And so Dean Pease was like, okay, we're not calling that anymore. So when we're talking about the 60% of the playbook that he installed, or really the 40% that has not yet been installed, according to Dean Pease, I think a lot of that is just basically not new concepts that he's going to bring to the defense. It's just more frequency of some of the things that we saw already last year, which is, again, more of those creepers, more of those 5-man pressures, and all that various stuff. When it goes back to the conversation about dialing up more man coverage and Dean Pease saying we need to get better in man coverage, that led to a lot of people thinking that the Falcons would look for, like a Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley at the top of the draft back earlier this offseason. My conclusion was that he wanted to improve in man coverage, because in those first couple of games, primarily man coverage was used in the red zone. Like 50% of his man coverage calls in the first 2 weeks came solely in the red zone. And so if they can get better in man coverage in the red zone, that means they're going to get more stops in the red zone. And obviously that will improve the defense. I think was 24th in the league last year in red zone efficiency against last season. So that's where I think that comes from. But again, overall, I think we're going to see more zone coverage, more focus on zone coverage, more of these creepers, more 5 or more man pressures and whatnot moving forward. So we're going to see Dean Pease, that 40% essentially is Dean Pease being a lot more aggressive with the creepers and a lot more aggressive throwing 5 and 6 man pressures at opposing teams this season. And I think that's evidence when you sort of understand that and you look at the Falcons offseason moves. It kind of shows that I think that's the direction that the team is going into. And we'll talk about players like Casey Hayward and Lorenzo Carter, as well as some of the draft picks, and how they fit into this idea moving forward on today's Locked On Falcons episode, guys. But before we get there, I do want to let you know that, the NBA draft is just around the corner, and the ultimate NBA mock draft starts this week, Thursday on June 16th. You can find over 50 insiders, on the ultimate NBA mock draft. You got the big board, you got the Locked On draft experts, plus Odyssey insiders. That first pick is Thursday, June 16th. All you got to do is search Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and follow so you don't miss a pick. And guys, there's no better time given the draft time to go on over to betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. You can find the latest odds, contests, player props, and more. Of course, this time of year is great. You got the NBA draft, who's going to be the number one pick, who's going to be all these various props that you can put in now at betonline.net. You also got US Open coming up in golf. You got Wimbledon, you got Stanley Cup finals, NBA finals, Major League Baseball. Of course, you can find other sports like boxing, esports, even your favorite Vegas casino games at BetOnline. You can also get in on these NFL props for the upcoming season. Drake London, Offensive Rookie of the Year, Arthur Smith, Coach of the Year, Marcus Mariota, Comeback Player of the Year. You can put in on all these things at BetOnline, where the game starts. So, obviously, because of my belief that Dean Pease wanted to play a lot more zone, one of the keys to playing more zone is that you got to get pressure with 4, right? That's the tendency with zone. That's one of the, depending on, who you got up front, it could be a strength or a weakness of zone, that tends to be a little bit more reliant on 4-man. Obviously, as we just discussed, though, Dean Pease may be willing to dial up more 5-man, but still at the end of the day, you still have to find ways to get pressure when you only rush 4, because the vast majority of the time you're still going to rush 4. And that led to the Falcons making upgrades at that edge rusher position. Hopefully we'll have another upgrade at that interior D-line position later this summer. And yes, I will vow that we will not go more than 3 or 4 episodes of this podcast for the next 2 months without me mentioning that the Falcons will be, hopefully signing one of those interior defensive linemen later this summer. But we know that in addition to upgrading the edge rush group and hoping that, guys like Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone will help bolster this team's ability to get pressure with 4. We know that the other area where the Falcons probably made the biggest upgrade this offseason was at the cornerback position. We're fans of Fabian Moreau here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, but certainly Casey Hayward is a significant upgrade. And I think that's led a lot of people to talk about the Falcons having, one of the best secondaries in the league. I feel like people are buying into the hype a little bit too much. We kind of need to see what this safety group is before we can start selling the entire idea of the entire secondary being one of the best ones in the league. But I certainly think you can make a case that this cornerback room, either whether you're looking at the duo of Terrell and Hayward or the trio of Terrell, Hayward, and now a returning Isaiah Oliver, is one of the better units in the league. I certainly think in terms of cornerback duels with Terrell and Hayward, they're potentially top 5, maybe certainly top 10. I think you can make a really case for, and the main reason why they're ranked so highly is because they're arguably the best zone coverage duo in the NFL. Casey Hayward was the second highest graded cornerback in the league last year after Adoree Jackson in zone coverage, according to Pro Football Focus. AJ Terrell was number 5 on that list. Isaiah Oliver didn't qualify because he didn't play enough snaps, but if you lower the threshold for him to qualify, he would have finished 20th among zone cover grades and whatnot. And really the only team that you could probably make a compelling case, at least based off of the 2021 PFF grades and zone coverage, that could be in conversation with the Falcons for the best zone trio in the league, assuming that, Hayward, Terrell, and Oliver pick up where they left off last year, is basically the Eagles trio, which consists of Darius Slay, who was number 9 in zone coverage, James Bradbury, who was number 12, and Avonte Maddox, who was number 32. So hopefully Isaiah Oliver, coming off this ACL injury, will pick up where he left off last year. And of course, Hayward, can pick up where he left off last year with the Raiders, and so that will give the Falcons a really strong cornerback trio when they run zone, and hopefully will also give them a much better cornerback trio when they run those man coverage concepts in the red zone and get some of those stops there. In addition to, circling back, to the edge rusher group, when you look at Lorenzo Carter, we're talking about Casey Hayward being one of the top cover corners in the league. Lorenzo Carter is one of the top cover edge rushers in the league. I know that's a weird concept to come across, but in terms of guys available this offseason, he was the top, free agent edge rusher in terms of his coverage grade. He earned a 81.7 coverage grade from Pro Football Focus last year. He's earned an 80 plus coverage grade in 3 of the last 4 years. And I think even the fourth year where he didn't get that, it was still like a 65 or somewhere in that range. So certainly one of the best coverage edges in the NFL. And so when we talk about what Stephen Means did in those first 2 games of the season, dropping the coverage on average 15 times a game, Lorenzo Carter is, perfectly suited to do that. Stephen Means earned a coverage grade of 49. Now you're upgrading to a guy that had an 81 or 82. So when we're talking about running those creepers, Lorenzo Carter is the perfect guy to be the one that Dean Pease is dropping off into coverage while he's bringing that linebacker or cornerback on one of those blitzers. We talked about D'Angelo Malone recently on our scouting report on the last episode this past Friday, and we talked about his athleticism to be that guy that can play in space and play in coverage. And while he still is a work in progress with that, given he didn't do a ton of that at Western Kentucky, he certainly has the athleticism to be a high value player there. If and when in the future, if the Falcons do decide to move on from Lorenzo Carter at some point in the future, D'Angelo Malone could certainly fit and sort of has the potential to inherit that mantle and be a high level coverage player moving forward. Now, when we talk about, if you're dropping Lorenzo Carter, you're dropping D'Angelo Malone, we talked about the cornerbacks coming on those blitzes. What about the linebackers? One of those second level defenders in the linebacker, bringing it on the blitz. And the Falcons, of course, added Rashaan Evans, certainly a more physical linebacker and downhill player. So you would imagine it's going to be a big upgrade in terms of his pass rush ability. But when you look at the Pro Football Focus numbers, he's not really significantly better a pass rusher, at least based off of his opportunities in Tennessee, than what the Falcons had in Foye Oluokun and Deion Jones these last couple of years. All right. In 2018 and 2019, when Dean Pease was the defensive coordinator of the Tennessee Titans, Rashaan Evans was a starter, of course, and his pressure rate, based off of how many pressures he was generating on his pass rush steps, was about 12%. You compare that to Foye Oluokun in the last 2 years, is about 15%, and Deion Jones is actually 19%. If you're curious, Michael Walker over the last 2 years is about 9%. But notably, Nick Kwiatkoski, the late May addition to the Falcons, his pressure rate throughout his NFL career is 27%. You also look at Troy Anderson, the Falcons' second round draft pick. His pressure rate this past year at Montana State was 33%. Now, I'm skeptical on whether that's going to translate directly to the NFL, given the lower level of competition, given some of the concerns with Anderson and his play strength. But certainly, I think Anderson probably is better suited to be more the coverage guy, at least early in his career. But certainly, there's something there to develop, right? I think a lot of his pressures at Montana State came when he was able to come free, which of course is what you're hoping for if you're scheming up these creepers and all these blitzes or whatever the case may be. But at the NFL level, you're going to have to beat some of these guys with blocks. And Anderson didn't do that particularly well at Montana State, getting kind of stonewalled by some undersized running backs. So that's something that he can improve on. But at least Kwiatkoski, if the Falcons do feel like they can bring one of these linebackers, not just Rashaan Evans, but potentially Nick Kwiatkoski, based off of his career production. Obviously, he hasn't played as much as some of these other linebackers that we're talking about, like Evans and Oluokun, and Deion Jones. But in limited opportunities, he's been very productive as a pass rusher. So all these moves kind of make sense when we're talking about Dean Pease wanting to use more creepers, Dean Pease wanting to bring more pressure in that regard. And we'll also sort of have to see if Michael Walker can improve his production as a pass rusher. He hasn't been great in that regard these last 2 years, but certainly has the potential given that he has that pass rushing background from his days at Fresno State. So we'll see if that can be developed this season and in the future. But we can talk all day long about these player fits or whatever the case may be. But now I think with this newfound perspective on how these off-season moves in free agency especially fit in with the plan for this defense in 2021, I think a lot of these guys like Casey Hayward, Lorenzo Carter, Nick Kwiatkoski, Rashaan Evans really do fit well with, Dean Pease trying to implement that last 40% of his playbook. And I think we're going to see a lot more aggressiveness from Dean Pease with some of the play calling that he has this season. Of course, I still have some concerns about where the offense is headed and the direction they're going, but I think the direction of this defense is moving in the right direction. Again, I think these are steps that the Falcons have taken this offseason that we should see significant growth from this defense instead of being that bottom 3, bottom 5 unit that they were a year ago. Hopefully we can crack out of the bottom 10, right? We can get in that 20-ish range, 2022-ish range, or possibly even better. Again, I'm not going to sit here and predict that they're going to be a top 10 unit or anything like that, but I certainly think they can be a lot closer to the middle of the pack if some of these additions will allow Dean Pease to dial up some of these things and help confuse some of these quarterbacks that they're going to be facing this upcoming season. So that will do it for us here, guys, on my investigative report here on what is left remaining of Dean Pease's playbook. And maybe that will allow us to talk a little bit more about the safeties and how they may be implemented in this stuff. And sort of, people have been talking quite a bit about, the combination of Richie Grant and Jalen Hawkins and what those guys may be in store for this season. So that may be a good topic of discussion on tomorrow's episode. If you want to suggest future topics, of course, you can do so by hitting me up via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Let me know what you think about this investigation. And what you think, Dean Pease means by only installing 60% or whatever the case may be. So you can do that here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel with a comment or your feedback on one of the other addresses. And guys, before we duck out of here, want to remind you of the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft. Head on over to Blue Nile, head on over to betonline.net. And of course, as your second listen of the day after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen, if you don't want to check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, whatever the case may be, go check out Locked On Hawks. But, you can also check out Locked On NFL if you want to keep your ear to the ground on all the things going on in the rest of the NFL during as we sort of things start to slow down this summer. Of course, Locked On NFL is a great follow and great subscription for you guys to stay in tune for all 32 NFL teams. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL as well as all Locked On shows on the same podcast platforms that you're listening and or watching Locked On Falcons. Guys, I appreciate it. Till then.